Continuing our conversation about Austrian economics, we just talked about your favorite subject, which is the Austrian business cycle theory. My favorite, I think, is the Austrian critique of socialism and how central planning is impossible, despite the supposed best intention of these planners. And it really comes down to the knowledge problem. We're talking about the way that prices are signals, and they ensure that people can allocate resources. And the original conception, and Ludwig von Mises wrote an entire book criticizing the original conception, Marx's conception of socialism. The original idea was to eliminate money, eliminate markets, and replace it with rational central planning. Why doesn't that work?
Because the central planner, it's twofold. The central planners do not have perfect knowledge. That's impossible. Even if you had a supercomputer that could pull all this data, you wouldn't have perfect knowledge and be able to keep up with the dynamics of the economy. As we said, the market is a process. It is not static. It's very dynamic, and it's always changing. Every little thing that changes has an impact here, and there's no way that a human being, a supercomputer, or anything else could keep up with that. And they also can't predict the future. Going back to human beings, people are not always rational. And I say that's even a subjective term, because what you think is rational might be different than what I think is rational. So you have all these different actors making decisions. There's no way that you can predict that. You're outside of the market, so you're in a much less advantageous position than business people and entrepreneurs who are actually in the market, whose lives and livelihood literally depend on making these decisions and making accurate predictions. The other reason is because this goes back to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, is because prices are signals. What they do is they tell you how society values this versus that. And once that's corrupted, that's when you end up with all the issues that we talked about with the boom-bust cycle. Well, it's even worse if there are no signals. In fact, it's really never been tried. Pure communism, it's never been tried. Oh, the Soviet Union. Here's something about the Soviet Union. The central planners in the Soviet Union struggled with this, and it really has to do with the allocation of resources. Do we use this steel to make a railroad car, or do we use it to make a lawnmower? Right? That's the relationship. Right? The railroad car is a lot more expensive. There aren't as many of them, and the lawnmower is this cost. But those are relations to each other. What the central planners in the Soviet Union would do is they would get mail order catalogs, like Sears and JCPenney catalogs from the United States, so that they could kind of figure out, okay, this thing is how much in relation to this thing, and that's how they made some of their decisions, right? Pure socialism, pure communism has actually never been tried. It's an impossibility, because in order to do that, you'd almost have to go back to a barter system, which just won't work for any, other than Matt and Glenn trading, a barter system ain't gonna work. And it ain't really gonna work for us either.
The two closest attempts at real socialism was war communism under Lenin, after the communist revolution, and fast forward to Mao's Great Leap Forward in China. Those two experiments in socialism led to mass starvation on a scale unimaginable by any of the young people who are flirting with the S word today. And it's because the production allocation of resources completely breaks down.
Right.
And they don't know what to do.
Right. There's a moral component here too, even though we're discussing morality, and that is, if people don't agree with your decisions and you're the boss, how are you going to make them agree with that? You're going to put a gun to their head, or you're going to starve them, or you're going to do whatever. But your freedom of choice, which I believe it's a gift from God, your free will, the ability to make decisions for yourself, it's gone completely. under that system. So yeah, you have the practical, the economic arguments against socialism, but there's also a moral argument. It is not compassionate. It is brutal. And as you pointed out, you can look at the different socialist regimes throughout history, and it's not, oh my gosh, they're giving me all this free stuff. It's like, you're going to do that or we're going to kill you.
Yeah. It's interesting you point that out, because you think about the evolution of the Soviet Union. They went from what was an ideologically driven attempt to transition from what they would say late stage capitalism to a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then this beautiful communist thing somehow happens. But 1918, 1919, 1920, people are starving en masse. Eventually, Joseph Stalin takes over, to Hayek's point. Eventually, the worst people get in power because they're very efficient at violence and they have no compunction. And again, like I think this is why the Austrians attract so many people that start sort of as a libertarian political philosophy, because ultimately there's two ways to organize society. You can focus on cooperation and trade, and that might lead to really beautiful things like mutual respect, or you can use violence and force people to do the things they don't want to do. Socialism, the experiments always devolve into something that looks more like fascism, just authoritarianism, just violence.
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right. And the reason is because I'm not always going to agree with what a central planner tells me to do. I'm either going to be miserable or I'm going to try to do something about it. And generally you can't do anything about it because they're the ones with guns. And we've seen this happen throughout the world. Pol Pot, Stalin with the starvation regime, Mao. So yeah, it's not just an economic argument, but it's also the fact that that society, the basis of that society, whereas unlike in a free society where the basis is voluntary exchange, which engenders mutual respect, the basis of that society is violence, which actually causes resentment across everything, not only towards the government, but also to other individual citizens. I'm reading a book right now. It's called Reading Lolita in Tehran, and it's set right after the Iranian Revolution, and just talks about life in Iran, especially among the writer is a female English literature professor. And just like in East Germany with the Stasi, and the way you got ahead was by snitching on your neighbors, yeah. In post-revolutionary Iran, all these different factions emerged and they all hated each other. Yeah, we have stuff in America, and I would argue that a lot of our issue here is because socialism is making a comeback. But I'm hoping that that's an anomaly, and at some point we regain our senses. That's not the basis of our society. That is the basis of an authoritarian society, which almost by definition has to be a heavily socialist or communist society, because you can't allow economic freedom within that society.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people would acknowledge that Ludwig von Mises, when he originally tackled the socialist calculation debate, and he argued that without money, without prices, you can't allocate resources, and the system is technically doomed to failure. And the socialists came back, the market socialists came back and said, okay, you're probably right. So we're going to have a little bit of market to allow us to allocate resources, but we're going to run it still from the top down. And many years later, after Hayek has had his frustrating debates with John Maynard Keynes, who was basically arguing for authoritarian manipulation of markets from a macro perspective to fine-tune the economy, he got into what I think is one of the most seminal articles in all of Austrian economics, the use of knowledge in society. Because he's frustrated that central planners still don't understand that without the process, there is no knowledge, and without knowledge, you cannot possibly reallocate resources better. So in some ways, I think the socialist calculation debate very much applies to every single flavor, including Keynesian macro manipulation of the economy.
Yeah, because what you're doing, like with the Keynesians try to get the best of both worlds, in that you try to have the innovation and everything from capitalism, but then there's this idea that capitalism at some point is going to run amok, animal spirits, and you have to take control. What they fail to realize is the market is self-regulating, and the market will punish bad actors. The market will end up punishing bad decisions. Well, you prop that up when you just throw money at the economy to get it revving again. And that's also taking things from this sterile classroom environment where everything's perfect to the real world. In a sterile classroom environment, you don't have to deal with the greedy people. And by the greedy people, I mean the folks that are closest to that money machine, right? They're the ones that are going to take advantage of this. It's not the average person out there who has the ability to do that. So it's also, going back to the individual, it's also failing to realize that the economy is not some abstraction. It's not just this big thing. It's individuals, that it's the market, it's people making decisions, it's people trying to better their lives. And you're actually hurting them by thinking that, we can manipulate these things and we can make life better for everybody, instead of just allowing people to make their own decisions about things. And then also, you get into the fact that nobody's ever going to have perfect knowledge. It's the only entity that has perfect knowledge is God. Central planners are not God. I'm not God. You're not God. We can't determine what the future is going to be. But when we make a bad decision, it doesn't impact just Matt and Glenn. If you're a central planner, it impacts the entire society. So really, I think at its core, actually, so much of what we see in modern economic thought and Keynesian thought is really an excuse for academics who otherwise wouldn't have a job to be very powerful decision makers and to control the levels of power, or the levers of power. And one final thought too. We've talked a lot about Mises. A lot of folks probably don't realize that Mises actually predicted the fall of the Soviet Union back in the late 1930s. And it took longer than he thought it would, but it eventually fell. Conservatives will point to the arms race in Reagan, and I think that did contribute to it, the fact that their economy was not as efficient as ours, so they just couldn't keep up. But in the end, the reason that it failed was exactly what Mises talked about. It was the fact that they had either had an absence of prices and the signals, or they were completely corrupted. And you just saw malinvestment, and eventually the whole thing just collapsed onto itself. I believe that people are much better positioned to make decisions about their own life than faraway bureaucrats and technocrats.